I'm Saladin Ambar. Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. Today, we are speaking with my colleagues at the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling about the role public opinion polls and public survey research plays in American democracy. This episode was recorded on September 27, 2022. Ashley Koenig is the director of the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling, the oldest statewide university-based survey research center in the country. She runs and is the face of the Rutgers Eagleton poll and is the youngest person to ever hold a position as director of ECPIP, and currently the only woman university-based statewide pollster in New Jersey. Ashley received her PhD degree in political science from Rutgers and has co-authored several book chapters and papers on public opinion. In 2015, she was awarded the John Tarnay Memorial Scholarship by the Association of Academic Research Organizations and currently serves on the council of the Pennsylvania-New Jersey chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. Joining Ashley on the podcast today are several of her colleagues. Deborah Borey-Holtz is the Senior Survey Scholar at ECPIP and an Associate Professor in Teaching at the Blaustein School at Rutgers. Her research focuses on the administration of American elections and policy making in the states. Jessica Roman is a research associate at ECPIP. Her research interests include the real-life implications of social, education, and immigration policies. Kyle Morgan is a research associate at ECPIP and assistant professor of political science at Francis Marion University. His research focuses on the American judiciary. Welcome to you all. Ashley, I'd like to start with you. Welcome again. Could you tell us a little bit about ECPIP and the services you provide in a broad sense?
Sure. Thanks so much for having us, Dean. So as you mentioned, we are actually the oldest statewide university-based polling operation in the country. It's a really neat legacy to have. So this means, all other academic types of polls were born after us. We're 50 plus about 1 years old right now. Pandemic math makes it a little difficult, but we celebrated our 50th anniversary and we have 5 decades of data on New Jerseyans, their attitudes, their behaviors, their practices, as I like to joke, on those really important matters like deer hunting and going down the shore, and whether it's Taylor ham or pork roll, and those other matters that are not as consequential like elections and the economy and taxes. But we have had the Rutgers Eagleton poll as our public face, and then we do a whole host of work and research services for researchers inside and outside of Rutgers University, for those inside and outside of the state government, as well as nationally, and spanning the gamut in terms of the types of topics we cover, whether we're talking about public health or climate change or gun violence, politics, you name it, we've probably polled on it.
Wow. Well, I had no idea you were polling on deer hunting. And so having grown up in Queens and having lived in New Jersey for a long time, I have to say I still am struck by the variety of life in New Jersey. So that's phenomenal. Could you share with us, I know you not long ago released a poll with some interesting results on sex education and firearms. Can you share a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, I'm going to turn this over to Jess in a second, but essentially, we always try to pull the hot topics of the day, and clearly sex education has been one of the biggest topics, one of the biggest flashpoints in New Jersey. And so let me have Jess talk a little bit about that before we go into gun violence and our partnership with the Gun Violence Research Center here at Rutgers. So Jess, did you want to take that one on sex ed?
Yeah, absolutely. So just reiterating what Ashley said, it has been such a hot button issue in the state this year with new standards taking effect this school year on health and sexual education. And being able to line up the start of the school year with these questions was very important to us. So originally, we wondered if there would be any difference in results by adding age appropriate to the question of whether or not a respondent generally favored or opposed having health and sexual education taught to students at all levels of education, K through 12, so elementary, middle, and high school. However, we found there actually was no statistically significant difference with those results. So unsurprisingly, there was more movement when we asked about the elementary school with the age appropriate phrase versus without, but again, it was not statistically significant. What we did find more generally was that New Jerseyans are largely supportive of health and sexual education being taught in middle and high school, but the idea of it being taught in elementary school is much more divisive. So just under half of residents favor health and sex ed being taught in elementary schools, while half oppose it. One thing that I actually would love to be able to do when we're creating these polls, we always think we wish we had more. We wish we had more time, more questions, more respondents. But when you make a survey too long, you obviously run into the issue of respondent fatigue. Now, if I could have asked more questions, I would love to probe further into different facets of health and sex ed because it includes so many things. And maybe residents are staunchly opposed to some of those things being taught in elementary school, but they might be much more amenable to others. So that could definitely show up on a future survey. But
and to
beyond,
kind of, sorry, Jess, I was going to say,
No.
to add to that also, like Jess points out, it's really a perfect example of how we see kind of the vocal, visceral reactions we may see in the media are anecdotal and don't necessarily translate into public opinion. Jess did say that we do see division. We see a pretty even split when it comes to teaching in an elementary school, but on the whole, New Jerseyans are pretty positive about sex education. They do want to see parental choice, but they also want to make sure that curriculums are standardized. And this is really one of those cases where I think, the hot topic that we see in the news doesn't really translate into the visceral reactions once we actually look at a representative form of public sentiment.
Well, it's interesting because I noticed that there was quite a bit of coverage in New Jersey and perhaps beyond about this poll. And to my understanding, it seems like the media got it right in terms of what the poll was picking up, as you suggest, with respect to nuance. Do you feel the same way? And how do you feel about how journalists pick up on your polling? Do you feel pretty good about it? Or do you think maybe they sometimes, on occasion, maybe miss your point? I was curious because I thought this one seemed to be right.
That is an excellent question. And I think it's an eternal struggle. I mean, I always kind of like to think about the 4 Ps of the polling process. We're talking about the polls, the public, the policymakers, and the press, and they're all interconnected. And ideally, we're producing polling data about the public so that it's conveyed to the policymakers. And in the words of the modern day scientific polling founder, George Gallup, it's supposed to make a truer democracy. Obviously, we have the press somewhere in between, and we know that media, we know politicians, candidates, figures of any kind can really frame stories and issues to their own agendas, whether for nefarious purposes or not saying it's necessarily intentional or trying to be, secretive or mysterious. But, I think it's a press release by press release basis in terms of how these get interpreted. And I think, and I am so lucky that the 4 of us, between Debbie, Jess, and Kyle, we all work together to make sure that we view this not only with an academic lens, but also with, a rigorous scientifically methodological interpretation when we talk about these numbers, because it could be a real fire starter with how the media may interpret a headline, especially when we're talking about pre-election polls. And sometimes it's conveyed properly, sometimes it's not conveyed properly. And that makes all the difference in how people interpret polls. And let's face it, most people are not looking at one of our press releases to read the information, firsthand directly. They're probably hearing about it in a soundbite in the media. And so it's then up to us as well to make sure that we're interpreting the numbers with the most precision that we possibly can to make sure that that idea is conveyed about the inherent uncertainty that underlies polling. It's based on statistics. So we're talking about probability here. We're not talking about, numbers that are set in stone.
Right. Well, speaking of, some controversy, perhaps, or alleviating controversy, if these issues and poll results are covered properly, let's move on to what you found with respect to firearms.
Sure. So we've been very fortunate to have a partnership with the Gun Violence Research Center here at Rutgers, and they do absolutely incredible work, not only on a statewide basis, but also on a national basis. And so we found, in collaboration with them on the most recent poll, we found that most New Jerseyans actually are concerned about gun violence and want stricter federal gun laws. About half say that gun control is more important than the right to own a gun. But we did find something very interesting with yet another experiment that we did talking about gun control versus limitations to access and requirements for firearm storage. Not that, we've found the rainbow that will cure all hyperpartisanship, but what we saw in the numbers was pretty neat, that actually when we rephased it in a less stigmatized, less charged language, moved away from gun control and instead talked about it as limitation and requirement, Republicans were more likely to actually support the gun control side of the question than they are when told strictly about gun control. Again, these are very highly charged issues, very stigmatized issues. But again, we see New Jerseyans really in support of many of these issues in terms of gun control, typical partisan divides, typical gender divides that we would expect to see. And, I think partisanship is just bleeding through everything nowadays.
Well, absolutely. And it is amazing how just maybe the shift of one word in a question can change outcomes. It's really remarkable. Shifting the focus to the midterm elections, what are some of the issues that are moving voters and are showing up in the polls? Anything jump out at you?
I feel like all I keep saying is it's an unprecedented election cycle. And I think I've been saying that for 3 cycles at this point. But we are doing a lot with pre-election polling. We have done it over the years. I'm going to pitch to Debbie. Debbie, do you want to talk a little bit about what we found in past election cycles and leading up to this current election cycle with the midterms?
Your question was right on target in terms of, does the media understand this, and does the public understand the sound bites? One of the things that we're maybe a little sensitive to, and there are headlines that the polls got it wrong. Actually, we know for elections, midterms, general elections, local elections, the polls are not intended to predict the outcome. So they're just a snapshot in time. And if we have multiple snapshots, they're very good at looking at trends. Are issues trending a certain way? Are candidates' likability, support trending up or down? They're very useful tools for that, but not actually predicting the outcomes. And I think one of the things that challenged us in the gubernatorial, getting it right, and we as academics and also as pollsters, we put the lens back on our staff after we do a poll, particularly an election poll. What did our estimates look like? How precise were we capturing what voters were thinking? But one of the things that we, don't have enough time to talk about in a press release is something called coverage error. And basically, we all are pretty familiar with sampling error and the margin of error, but there's a lot of error that happens before you even, besides measurement error, what we've talked about, question wording, question order, something called coverage error. Nobody knows what that is. And pollsters are really intended to survey in a random way those folks that are the target population. So it's really easy for New Jersey. We have the census data. We have population benchmarks. When it comes to an election cycle, these days, since 2018, there is no historic trend to look to. 2018 had folks turning out for the first time that don't typically come out to vote. And they had a lot more folks, presidential levels that we saw. And we saw the same thing in our off-term, our off-year elections in New Jersey with the gubernatorial. We will determine on the front end who's the likely voter. And the secret sauce is in that. All pollsters have their own way to measure, are you a likely voter? Some will generally survey the populations. Other will stick to registered voter list. There's not an absolute science when it comes to somebody telling you, yes, I'm absolutely going to vote. So are we actually talking to likely voters? And then on the back end, which we hope we are, then we have to wait. What do these population parameters look like? Or do they look like actual voters? So unless we had a crystal ball, we may get it wrong based on the weighting, because we know what typically turns out in a midterm may in fact not be the audience who turns out in a midterm. So when you look at hot button issues, women registration is up, young voters registration is up. It doesn't mean that every voter who's newly registered actually cast a ballot. But guess what? There's a nuanced, a new potential target population that's in the electorate. And so what our tip is if you're looking at these national polls or statewide polls, and we have to do this internally, right? It's the scary part of this. what are we waiting to? Who do we think is going to turn out? And I think the only thing that we all agree on right now is it's not going to look like the historic midterm elections in terms of turnout. So potentially every poll out there that says generic ballot says this, someone's up, someone's down. The bottom line is they don't know. That's their best guess. And if they're basing it on past historical trends, it's probably wrong. So nobody should be surprised if the polls don't get it right? Because it's the method that determines that and the decisions you make.
Do we have any sense, Debbie, of who these new voters were in 2018 and what may have motivated them?
Yeah, I mean, nationally, and this is the lovely part too, right? It's all different by state. So we're pretty proud of our statewide poll, but we know that a national poll isn't going to capture what's happening in New Jersey because it's not intended to do that, right? There's not enough cases from every state. You'd have to have roughly a poll of 20,000 folks to be able to get a real good predictor. But what we learned overall in 2018 is that there were new voters, not new to the state, but just hadn't registered, and a significant increase in women across the state, as well as a little tiny bump in young voters. High registration didn't turn out as much as women, but African American women significantly turned out in higher numbers in the midterms. And we saw that pattern in a lot of states like Georgia in 2020. They made the difference, absolutely, by maybe 4 or 5 points. So when you win Georgia by, 11,700 and whatever the ex-president was looking for, it doesn't take that much tick up in turnout to get that margin number, that win number.
Right. Well, we'll be curious. I'm sure we'll all look to see if there's a new batch of voters in 2022. If the midterms portend that, we'll stay tuned and probably come back to you all about that. So, you've already suggested this. The public has, to varying degrees, become wary about opinion polls over the past few election cycles. The former president of the United States has infamously, perhaps if I can use that word, derided polling. And many others, perhaps less harshly, have done the same. What do you say to folks who, don't necessarily understand that this is not a predictive business? How do you address to the American people the question of wrong polls that are constantly getting it wrong, et cetera? How do you handle those kinds of questions?
Yeah, this is the problem, right? This is our big challenge as an industry, particularly since 2016. Especially now that polls are becoming another political institution that is becoming stigmatized and politically polarized as well. And so it becomes really difficult. I mean, the industry has been trying each election cycle to introduce something new after 2016, knowing that pollsters had missed the non-college white, in particular white male vote. Pollsters began weighting to education. So that entered the fray in 2018 and onward. 2018 polls were pretty on the money when they had been done for that midterm cycle. 2020, again, we know who was at the top of the ticket for the second time. And that became really damaging because Republicans, Trump voters, those within Trump's base, became very untrusting of answering polls. And we had talked about in 2016, the shy Trumper theory. Maybe a voter was not confident enough because of things like social desirability bias and not wanting to admit to an interview, they'd vote for Trump. This kind of morphed into, by 2020, a defiant Trumper theory that maybe they were purposely not picking up the phone, not answering polls. Put on top of that, a pandemic where those who had the luxury of staying home and were more likely to pick up their phone and answer a telephone poll call were likely more democratic, more likely to have a job at home that they were more affluent to afford to pick up the phone, not Trump voters. And so there is a really concerted effort. And while the challenge is still out there going into 2022, really concerted effort by pollsters to keep looking at this issue and keep making sure that we have the appropriate amounts and the appropriate kinds of Republicans. We may have the correct amount of Republicans in our poll, but that doesn't mean we necessarily have the correct kind of Republican, the Republican that is voting for Trump. So it has become a big question in this kind of new Trumpian area of politics. But by that same token, it's the best and most representative tool that we have. I like to be a hopeless romantic when it comes to polling, that really it's the one participatory act that we have that takes so little of your time, takes none of your money. In fact, sometimes we pay you to participate the way in which you're represented in the population. And sometimes we don't even need to contact you, but we're talking to somebody just like you. And your views are being represented in the way in which it stands in the actual population. You know, we talk about rallies and protests and donations, and all of this takes time. It takes money, time away from your job, money away from your pocket. And those get really hard. And usually the people with the loudest voices are the ones who get hurt through a lot of those actions because they have the resources to commit that. We are representing you in the way in which you should be in the population. And you know, I think it just needs to be, as Debbie had pointed out, more of this understanding that polling is both an art and a science. There is so much subjectivity that leads into those seemingly objective numbers that we get to at the end. And that's why it's so important to lessen the focus on the horse race and ramp up talk about the inherent statistical uncertainty, you know, talking about the margin of error and talking about it more like, hey, this is like a weather report. It's up to you to decide if you want to bring your umbrella. If we say it's a 60% chance or an 80% chance of rain, but, you know, we're not telling you who's going to win on election day. This is, Debbie, as Debbie said, a snapshot in time.
And I would say to that, we had to present, not we offered to present. Kyle and I represented ECP at APOR, which is our association. And Kyle, I mean, everybody was asking the same question. All the really smart people in the room were asking the same question that you're asking. I mean, what were some of the things we took away, Kyle?
I think that, right, part of it was we've got to expand the modes of recruitment, right? Reaching people where they're at. And polling's been kind of reluctant to embrace online or text message recruitment. And that's becoming more accepted. And some of the work we've been doing is looking at how reliable this information is, right? Are we tapping into different voters? We might have had some cases where some of our pre-election polling, we tapped into kind of, right, like the skeptical Trump-esque voter, right? How can we reach those individuals? But I think also fundamentally is, right, we need to encourage people to actually just do polls. When you get called, right, like take the 5-10 minutes and do it. I think my students are tired of hearing me say, right, like, hey, if you get called, do this, right? Like, please answer the survey questions. But I think, right, part of it is expanding methodology and then also trying to, like Debbie and Ashley both said, right, communicate some of the uncertainty that is inherent in polling. All right, it isn't exact, right? Take it as a snapshot in time too.
Well, I appreciate all of you for answering the question that I didn't get a chance to ask, or you preempted me, which is, what role do you think polling plays in a democracy? And I think I couldn't have anticipated a better set of answers than answer the poll, right? We complain about, the justice system is so terrible, but no one wants to serve on a jury, right? No one cares what I think. Well, you got to answer polls, right? So, or surveys. So I appreciate that.
The same thing goes to polling, right? It's not particularly in the midterm this year in 2022. There may be trends. There may be historic patterns. No one knows who's going to win. And you can win some of those races, those close congressional races, statewide races by, a few thousand votes. So people sit back and they see a poll that's taken early on a month or so ago, because a week in politics is a lifetime. Same thing happens in polling, right? History intervenes all the time. So if you're just sitting back and thinking there's no contest here, what we would hope that a poll with poor estimates doesn't keep people at home. You need to go vote, regardless of what the polls say. You need to show up. That in a democracy is your franchise. Prove the pollsters wrong. Show up on election day.
Just to add to what Debbie's saying too, just because somebody has said that they will vote for somebody, they haven't necessarily done that yet. These numbers aren't set in stone. If you're taking it that way, like we said, maybe you weren't the one who was polled, but we were polling somebody who was meant to represent someone who's just like you. And if now you're saying, well, they're going to go ahead and do it, so I don't have to, well, that kind of negates the whole point to begin with, was we were trying to represent what it would be like if you did go out to vote.
It's an important distinction, isn't it? I appreciate that. Could you give us a sneak peek into some upcoming polls? And then a final question, maybe for whoever wants to answer. When you share with people that you work in polling, that this is what you do for a living. Maybe you're at the supermarket or, in a drinking establishment, what have you. And someone asks, what do you do? And you tell them, well, I work in polls. What kind of reactions do you get? So maybe if we could get a sneak peek into what's coming up, and then maybe that as a final kind of send off for our listeners.
Sure. I love that. A sneak peek. I'm going to probably have Kyle, if you wanted to give a sneak peek at our January 6th and our Supreme Court data, some things that we polled over the summer. Just before you do that, though, I also wanted to hit home the point that polling is very expensive. And Debbie just brought up this point that, we do not have, we would love to have more frequent polling. Any pollster would. And I think that's part of the problem, especially when we're talking about presidential cycles where statewide polling much better mimics the Electoral College than national polling does, which mimics the popular vote. If we're having polls that aren't credible and polls that are few and far between, it is exceptionally difficult to predict what's going to happen on election day, on top of all the other issues we just discussed, because the funding for it is lacking throughout the entire country. I mean, I'm sure it's a global problem. It is just incredibly expensive, pointing back to what Kyle said, because simply people aren't responding. Response rates are in the low single digits right now and plummeted even further since 2016. So while we don't see differential response bias between those who talk to us and those who don't, being able to actually contact all the people we need to becomes a really arduous process. But Kyle, why don't you, for the people we did talk to on some of our latest polls, why don't you give us a little sneak peek into January 6th and the Supreme Court?
Sure. So the first thing was also the joke I usually tell about, telling people I work in polling was that originally I was going to go be a lawyer. I went to law school and then I do polling. So, I have this ability to pick things that people don't trust inherently. But we did some polling recently about January 6th. And I think that there's kind of a surface level, I guess, sort of optimism about it. But I think that kind of hides some of the problems about January 6th and the current political climate. So overall, New Jerseyans seem to be following the reports from January 6th, the committee pretty closely, So it was 56% said they were following it either very closely or somewhat closely. But when we look at the attitudes towards the actual events of January 6th, we found that 91% of Democrats said it was an effort to overturn a legitimate election, 54% of independents, and then 22% of Republicans. And so I think that this is kind of concerning about how we're talking about the events of January 6th, This was kind of an unprecedented attack on American democracy, but the media environment, the political environment has framed it in such a way that this narrative that it was an effort to prevent the implementation of a fraudulent election, which 58% of Republicans agreed with, has kind of taken ground. That's been a narrative that we've seen grow over time. And as our media environment gets more fragmented, that's the only message you're hearing, and then we also asked voters, which one of these comes closest to your views, This was an insurrection that's a threat to democracy. It was a political protest that's protected by the First Amendment, or it was an unfortunate event, but we needed to move past it. And what we found was that 88% of Democrats said that this was an insurrection, A slight majority of independents agreed, 51%, but 75% of Republicans said that it was either a protest or just something in the past that we need to move beyond, We need to forget about it. And I think there's a lot of things intertwined here, but I think the most troubling one is that it kind of reflects that our democracy is not in a healthy place, and voters are thinking of it, as an unhealthy place for very different reasons, You have Democrats that are saying, hey, we have this insurrection that happened, That's not a good thing in a democracy, But Republicans cling on to this big lie or kind of underselling some of the harm that came from, storming the Capitol. And what we've, not us particularly, but what we found in political science, is that there is this really weak commitment to democracy in American politics, So there's a 2020 paper that found the commitment to democratic principles generally gets shoved to the side when partisan politics comes into play. And I think we're sort of seeing that here, that, if we had flipped the roles in this, right, I would imagine Democrats would be saying, yeah, this was something in the past, move on, right? Or it was a protest, don't worry about it, right? Republicans would say, right, this was an insurrection and a threat. And I think we're just seeing our kind of partisan politics here override more fundamental concerns about the health of our country's democracy. And so it's all well and good that 58% of voters said they were very concerned about democracy, right? And a majority of Democrats, independents, and Republicans said that. But the reasons behind those, I think, are more important, right? Why are they saying that? And some of those are legitimate reasons, and some of them are based on, right, just outright lies about the previous election.
Well, it's a mouthful, Kyle. I mean, really, no, it's it's significant. We were talking earlier, I guess Debbie raised the issue of new voters, but, what are these new voters' attitudes, and what are they bringing into the political arena, and how are they interpreting life differently? And I think going back to that 2016 moment when a lot of this novelty in the electorate and in our politics sort of crystallized, just raises a host of new questions going forward. Any other new information, or Ashley or Jess or Debbie, anyone want to tell me what you're telling folks that you're, I don't want to single out a particular shopping store or a grocery store, but what are folks telling you, or how are they reacting rather when you tell them you work in polling?
My family just wants to talk about politics and all the time. Relatives want to ask me about the election all the time. Little do they know, and friends as well. This is the funny thing, right? I'm a political scientist. I'm a pollster. I proudly identify as both. I don't like politics. The reason why I do what I do is because I love assessing what the people think and feel. And that's what I fell in love with back in college. What do people think on a variety of issues? So it's not that I want to take sides on these issues. It's I want to see how the public feels about these issues. And also, I'm a born and bred Jersey girl. So to be able to do that in my home state is just, the dream. And I joke, we talk about Taylor ham and pork roll, but really about these statewide issues and even local issues that matter on a daily basis to the lives of a state, sometimes more than national issues do, or at least a lot of the hot topic national issues. There's so much of a focus on, or there's so much of a focus on national issues that a lot of times we ignore the absolutely crucial local and state issues that affect our daily lives. But everybody wants to talk about politics with me. Sometimes I even just say I'm a professor because it's hard to understand what a pollster is. And like Kyle said, you get conflated with being a lawyer and doing some dirty deed or something. But I really love being a survey researcher and especially for the state that we're in.
I think to that end too, just as I think we get just as excited, maybe more excited about our client projects because of the research that's being done. The amount of money that's being invested by a funder or their stakeholders to find out the root causes of police violence or the need for police reform, as we did after the consent decree in Newark, or other projects in New Brunswick, in Camden, in Newark, in Ocean, along the coastal areas that were brought into by other research entities at Rutgers, other agencies outside. We've done a host of on young adults, the influence of drugs, alcohol, sex on a population. So we get supercharged because we feel this is another way to enter the policy process, right? To find out what is the truth, what are people's attitudes, what are their behaviors, run experiments to try to see if one treatment will be more effective than another part. We get super excited when we talk to a potential new client because we're like, yes, we'd really love to do this, because we feel like we can shape the world in a small way by contributing, as Ashley said, to these issues that occur at the local level, in your neighborhood, everyday factors that if it wasn't for researchers and pollsters and survey, methodologies, they wouldn't even know where to begin. So it's just a great foundation for policy formation and implementation to see if the policy is effective. So that's what we get supercharged about talking about.
Yeah, and I think just even pivoting off of that, well, not so much because it's very much in the same vein, actually. I started off when I was in undergrad, before doing my master's and everything, going down a very different career path. And all of a sudden, I realized I wanted to do research. And a big part of the reason for that was I just really wanted to be able to give a voice to people who don't traditionally have a big voice in society, or they do have a voice, but that voice isn't being heard. And when we're able to do these client projects, in particular, working with very niche populations that you don't hear from as frequently, that means a lot to me, because all I want to do is be able to build the stage and hand them the mic. All I'm doing is reporting what they're saying. I'm just the vessel to get their voice out there. And so that's very important to me. But even beyond that, regarding what I tell people about polling, there was one time about a year ago, I was on my way to a wedding in Ohio. I was flying. I was in the airport with my sister, telling her about some of the gubernatorial polling that we had done, how we needed all of this waiting, how it was very much on my mind as I was trying to board this flight to Ohio and go to this wedding. And I felt a tap on my shoulder from a random person behind me. I've never met them before. And they asked, "You're a pollster?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they started talking how they were also involved with polling in New York. They had just gone off on their own. They were starting a new firm. And it was very exciting to nerd out with somebody for once, because when I speak with my family and friends, I just tell them I'm in research and they say what? And I say survey research, a lot of topics, because if I go too much deeper, they don't understand. But Ashley doesn't know, actually, that day I got a job offer in the airport from this other polling firm. And I said, "No, I'm pretty content at Eagleton, but thank you."
Wow, that's a great story. And if I can give a little Godfather information, as Tom Hagen told Michael Corleone in The Godfather 2, I don't have to share the ones I turned down with you, the offers that I turned down with you. So there you go. Outstanding. Wow.
We can't beat that story, Jess.
No, that's a pretty awesome one. Well, listen, I'm afraid that's going to have to be it. I do want to give Ashley an opportunity to share with us how we listeners can follow what's going on at the center, maybe some social media, and perhaps we can tag along individual accounts in the podcast link later on for our listeners. But how can folks follow the center?
Yeah, so please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. We also have our website at eagletonpoll.rutgers.edu. On Facebook and Twitter, I believe we're at Eagleton Poll. And so please follow us, sign up for our press release list if you want to actually receive our press releases when they're hot off the presses. And, hopefully you take one of our polls someday. And if you're not taking it, encourage others to do so.
Well, I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to dig a little deeper into the faces and the actions behind polling and what's going on here at Eagleton. So thank you all so very much. Really appreciate it. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on This Moment in Democracy. Be well. The Eagleton Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University. This Moment in Democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Eagleton supporters. To support our work, click the link in the description. Learn more about the Institute by visiting eagleton.rutgers.edu, signing up for our emails, and following us on social media.